Minglaba. I welcome you to UHF's Introduction to Conflict of Interest in a Humanitarian Context. I would like to remind you that CPIs and UHF team have a zero tolerance to fraud and corruption within their programs. Part of UHF's and the donors' commitment to anti-fraud is to provide you with fraud awareness trainings. Please make yourself familiar with the training. We hope that this training gives you important insights that provide awareness within your work setting. First, some instructions. At times I may ask you to stop and perform exercises or activities. Please use the pause and play buttons at any stage, and when I instruct you. If this training is facilitated, you can gesture to the facilitator and we can stop and discuss your question at the next appropriate time. As a member of the UHF partnership, we all come under a different set of policies and procedures. You should check your organization's conflicts of interest policy. The purpose of this training is to make you aware of conflicts of interests. We will make the assumption that a conflict of interest policy is in place in your organization. However, if one does not exist, UHF along with CPI should discuss matters at a later stage. Either way, this presentation is to raise awareness of conflicts of interests as related to you. For your understanding, the UHF team follows CPI's counter-fraud approach, which has 4 strands of defense and action. You may find your organization has a similar approach. They are 1. Deterrence. To discourage potential perpetrators from committing fraud and corruption. 2. Prevention. Reducing the likelihood and impact, severity, of fraud and corruption through limiting the opportunities for those who cannot be deterred. 3. Detection. The identification of suspicious activity that could be fraud and corruption. 4. Response. Acting on suspicion of fraud and corruption in a way that minimizes risk and maximizes the opportunity to improve resilience. This includes investigation, applying penalties and obtaining reimbursement. Here is a question you should be asking yourself. It is a great way to start training like this. Why are you here? Why do I need to learn about conflict of interest? First, for your knowledge. You must know that corruption is one of the most common occupational fraud schemes occurring globally. And conflict of interest is one of the most prevalent schemes of the corruption category, along with bribery. As an employee of the UHF Partner Group, you may find yourself involved in situations where you have a conflict of interest within your work. You may not even be doing anything wrong, or you never gave it much consideration. But if you have another business, a self-interests or a working relationship that could conflict with UHF's goals and business dealings, then you may have a conflict of interest, and you need to declare it, so it is clear to everyone you deal with and there is no misunderstanding. It does not mean you have to stop other businesses. But you do need to declare them. It is like playing with an open deck of cards. Everyone knows what is in play when they make decisions. This is why it is normally part of your work contracts. If you go to work for any company, it is expected that your duty is to work to achieve that company's business goals. Not another's. And not yours. Of course, we work to build our own personal career achievement and goals, which is fully supported. And what you do in your private time is your business. What about non-profit organizations' goals and objectives? We have a particular duty working here in UHF and partner organizations. Yes, it is a job. But it is one with wider societal goals. Unlike a for-profit organization, humanitarian organizations are established, not to profit themselves, but to better the prospects of the people they serve. So how we contribute, or use our influence at work, has an effect on these people. Okay. Let's do a 10-minute exercise to get our brain working. What do you think right now is a conflict of interest? Did you ever give it much thought? If you are by yourself, or with others, please do the following. Get a piece of paper and a pen. And write down your answers to the questions on the screen. It is okay to be wrong at this stage. This is a great way to measure your knowledge and understanding. The questions are: in your current understanding, what is a conflict of interest? And write down 2 to 3 quick examples of a conflict of interest in a work situation. Any will do. No one will examine this, so just be as quick as possible, and write what comes to mind. Then if we are in a group, we can share our thoughts. Let's take 10 minutes. Hit pause and I will see you when you get back. How did you go? Okay, what I want you to do is keep this information and reflect on it throughout the presentation. As a representative of the UHF partnership, we want you to understand what a conflict of interest is, and what obligations you have. If you are in a group, let's just quickly give some examples of your answers. Hit pause and tell each other 2 of your examples. And then we will move on. You have 5 minutes. I will wait for you. Did you know that most of you have probably signed a conflict of interest form as part of your employee contract? Did you know most donors also require staff and the organizations working for their funded projects to sign and declare conflicts of interest? In fact, there can be multiple types of conflict of interest forms that an organization must manage. The main one we will be discussing today is the type employees sign. Many organizations actually ask that it is signed annually. Employees and organizations should update their situation throughout the year. If things change, like if your brother or sister joins your workplace and no one knows you're supervising them. First, let's look at some definitions. You will find slightly different definitions in varying publications and web sources, but the main points will be relevant. Normally, the definition will vary depending on what type of sector the publication is in. Like finance, project management or health. Most are written for commercial companies, but the intentions are relevant. I will dissect one definition provided by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. A conflict of interest involves an employee's or agent's self-dealing. I will say that again. A conflict of interest involves an employee's or agent's self-dealing. An agent in this case would be someone acting on behalf of the organization. This is the first hint of why you are here. A conflict of interest is related directly to an employee's actions. That includes you. To continue. A conflict of interest occurs when an employee, manager, or executive has an undisclosed economic or personal interest in a transaction that adversely affects that person's employer. Again, that adversely affects that person's employer. Do you see the word interest in yellow? This is highlighting when an employee's interest is conflicting with their workplace's operations or business decisions. But because we are a humanitarian organization, I would suggest that this is also about the effect on our beneficiaries, donors and partners. Now that we have defined a conflict of interest, I must tell you that in certain circumstances, such as when you do not declare it, it can be considered corruption. As mentioned, a conflict of interest scheme involves the focus of an employee's influence over a work transaction or a decision that is to the disadvantage of their organization. If it is intentional, then it may be considered a fraud or corruption event. Conflict of interest can look the same as bribery, but it is different to those schemes. Bribery is where the fraudster is paid or bribed, so it is not self-interest, but generally someone else's interests. Remember, a conflict of interest is basically the work of self-interest of an employee or agent. Okay, now, I want to show you through some examples. These involve a conflict of interest that are frauds. This is how a sales, purchasing scheme may look. Your organization wants to purchase a large amount of goods. Someone in the organization, say the procurement officer, wants to buy from a particular company. He is telling everyone in the procurement committee that it is the only reliable company for those products in the country. In fact, what he has not told the organization is that he owns that company and will make extra money from the procurement. He commits the fraud by negotiating a high price for himself. He tampers with the bids to favor his company and approves false invoices from his company. Conflicts of interest come in many forms. Here are 5 work examples so you get an idea of the various situations you may find you have a conflict to consider. We will pause after each one and quickly discuss them. First, providing special treatment to someone, for example hiring, promoting or working with someone connected to the employee. Receiving gifts or kickbacks. Using company property for personal benefit, for example stealing office supplies, or using the work car for a second job. Giving confidential information to competitors or using it to start another business. Working on outside work or business activities, for example, taking sick leave to work at another job or working for a vendor of the company part-time. Are any of these a crime? Would you get arrested for doing any of these? No, not really, but the organization would not want you doing these without proper approval. A crime can only be formally applied by the country's legal system. In most cases, if you declared your interest to the correct authority in your organization, and they approve it, you should be okay if the information you provide is clear and accurate. Any questions? Let's have a look at a grant tender. Let's do one more question. A multiple choice. You are part of the tender committee, but you just found out that the organization where your cousin sister works, Health Action 365, has submitted a partner tender proposal to UHF. Your cousin sister has asked you to do everything possible to make sure that their organization will win the contract, because her job there depends on it. Which is the most appropriate answer? A. Tell your colleague, your brother, on the committee to select Health Action 365.
B. Do not say anything.
C. Report the conflict of interest to your organization. D. Hire an accountant for advice. Are there any other issues? Please pick your answer and discuss what is going on. Hit pause and declare your answer. Now I want you to look at the handout. NHS procurement. Take 5 to 10 minutes and discuss the conflict of interest issues in it. Please read it like you were the CEO of the British NHS, that is the National Health Service in Britain. The media has asked you to comment. Do you think the guy had a conflict of interest? Do you think his notification to the NHS was adequate? This really happened, and it happens a lot. What should have occurred? Alright. We are nearing the end. But here is something you could use in assessing, or understanding the nature of a conflict of interest that you may be thinking about. Actual. Potential. Perceived. Conflicts of interest. Let's read and understand them. The word charity is here, but I will use organization instead. Actual. You are being influenced by a conflict of interest. This is where you are involved in a decision at work, but you have an interest in this. It can influence the decision you are making for the organization you work at. The example here is, your organization is proposing grants to 10 kindergartens, but there are 20 who applied. Your child attends one. You know you hate the school supplies and equipment there, but their application was very poor. In this case, you are probably being influenced. In any case, it is hard to be impartial. What should you do? Potential. You could be influenced by your conflict of interest. You are a part-time board member for CPI and do not work on grant proposals. But now you have started work at 365 INGO in the grant proposal section. Both CPI and 365 INGO are applying for the new LIFT project grant. It requires a lot of work and knowledge. Who are your interests with? You might be influenced by 365 INGO for CPI's details. Or the other way around. What will influence you? What should you do? Perceived. You could appear you have a conflict of interest. You are the administration manager of CPI, who is reviewing a tender for services for the CPI office. Your brother works at one of the companies. You think you can assess the tenders fairly. And maybe you can. But what happens if you chose your brother's company, because it was the best? Then another company went to the papers complaining about CPI and that your brother works at the selected company. You may have selected the best company. But you appear to have, or a perceived conflict of interest to explain. And CPI looks bad in the newspapers. What should you do? You can see from those examples that recognizing a conflict of interest is a little challenging. We have to decide if it is actually, potentially, or even a perceived issue. But the best thing is to report or document it in your decision making. And have it approved by an appropriate person. Conflicts of interests have an ethical dimension. What if you suspect someone is committing a significant conflict of interest? Let's quickly look and discuss the handout. 3. Reporting suspected fraud, corruption or conflicts of interest. Let's wrap up the training. Here are the 6 main points. 1. A conflict of interest involves an employee's self-dealing. 2. A conflict of interest occurs when there is an undisclosed economic or personal interest in a transaction. 3. Conflicts of interest are events or existing influences that adversely affects that person's employer. 4. Balance your work priorities. Know what your decisions influence. 5. Remember, conflicts of interest can be actual, potential or perceived. 6. Remember, a conflict of interest occurs when there is an undisclosed interest. So declare them. That way, everyone knows what is in play, especially with those important business decisions. And finally, corruption is one of the most common occupational fraud schemes occurring globally. And conflict of interest is one of the most prevalent schemes of the corruption category. Making staff aware of conflict of interest issues is important to organizations' security. Well, we are at the end of this session. Thank you for your attention. We hope you have learned enough about conflicts of interest to inform your work and decision making. Now, do you have any questions?